My first reaction was that it was a wonderful rags to riches story, and it was almost fairy tale-esque. And I read the book, and there were moments that were really heartbreaking. And from those low points in Joe's life to reach the euphoria that he did was really compelling, and I was blown away by the story. So we meet Joe Rantz at 19 years old, and he's about to start university, which is a miracle to begin with because he's homeless. He lives in a car. He's been abandoned by his dad when he was 14. His mother died when he was 3. He's been fighting his whole life, and he's at this point where he's doing something really incredible. And he finds rowing because he needs to make some money to stay in university. He needs to pay for his tuition. And he just initially rows as a job, as a way to stay in school, but finds this thing that's bigger than him. For the first time in his life, he's found something that's more important than himself. He's wounded. He's a wounded individual. And he's used to being wounded. He's used to being abandoned. He's used to being alone. He's used to dealing with things in a very quiet way. And that's part of the struggle for him in being part of a team and being responsible for 8 other guys and being responsible for the boat rather than just himself. He has to learn to become a team player. And that's, you know, on a soul level, that's the thing that is so beautiful for Joe, that he understands that, he learns what that means, and he grows. Up until the Poughkeepsie race, Joe's just doing it. He's going through the motions. It's only when he's really forced to look into the mirror, Ulbrichtson kicks him out of the boat because his head's spinning and he's not concentrating, he's not being a team member. Ulbrichtson kicks him out of the boat, and in that moment he realizes he's got a choice. And can he face up to it? Can he take responsibility? Can he be part of a team? Or is he gonna do the same thing as he's always done and retreat and hide? And he makes the decision in that moment to take responsibility. And once he takes responsibility for his part in the boat and the boat itself, he becomes a leader, and he becomes someone that the other guys can look to and rely on. And he enjoys it. Coach Ulbrichtsen's an extremely stoic, shadowy figure to the boys up until they get selected to be in the boat. He's sort of hidden away and this godlike figure to everyone. And what's really brilliant is the way that Joel plays it. But also, you know, he dressed incredibly well. So what Jenny Egan's done with him adds to that. And Martin shot him. There's a lot of silhouettes of him. It becomes sort of this really shadowy figure, which is cool. But they don't get to know him as a man until much later. Joyce is someone that Joe used to ride the bus with to school. And once he learned the banjo, he would play songs to her and make her laugh and do anything for her attention. And when his family left him, she moved away as well, simultaneously, and they didn't see each other for a few years until they come back to university. And there she is. And she comes bounding over and says, "I know who you are." And it's the childhood sweetheart. It's the girl that he loved from the early days. And she helps him a lot because she's stable. She's a stable person. And he's never had that in his life. I guess that's what all of these people are. They're stable people for him to learn how to walk again. The first was our first day of training for rowing, and we were awful, and none of us knew what we were doing, to the point where now we push ourselves and push each other to drive the rate up and to go as fast as we can. And we're all incredibly proud of each other because of that. And we really did go through it. I mean, lots of arguments. Jack and I actually are the ones that argue the most because he sits in the 8, I'm in the 7. and the Cox is in front of him, and so we can't see anything, and we're trying to work out. He drives the boat, basically, the speed of the boat, and he's, we go at each other a lot, and we enjoy it. So to the point where we're, from the beginning, where we couldn't do it, to now, it's extraordinary. Like, what we've been able to achieve has blown my mind. I didn't think we'd be able to do that. To be lifted up in the way that we have felt it has been incredible. And the story, the rags to riches almost doesn't do it justice, What these guys go through, like you say, where they've come from. Most of these guys have a pot to piss in, and they have to find it from somewhere to achieve what they achieved. Yeah, it's a beautiful story, and there's loads of things. I was actually talking about the Jubilee weekend that we had here the other day, and it was so nice to see everyone together, and it's such a rarity, and that's what this film does. It brings people together, and they achieve something extraordinary against all odds. Hadley Robinson's incredible. She brings a beautiful energy and really grounded and truthful in moments that our moments are really beautiful because of the way that she plays them and because of the truth that she brings. And her Joyce is really wonderful. He's an incredible actor. He's one of the best, as far as I'm concerned. Someone that I look at him and I think the jobs that he does and the way he acts is how I want to do it. It's really it's wonderful what he does, and he's just a beast. He's a pure beast, and he makes Ulbrichtsen really human. It's a lot of the stuff that it's giving instructions or giving orders to the boys or setting out the rules, but he makes them so genuine. You live in that moment. But they're just amazing guys, first and foremost. They're just really chilled. Nothing's a bother. They've been there, they've done it, they've seen it. And you feel very safe immediately to be yourself, and that's an important thing. You feel part of the team, you feel part of the creative decisions. There's never a no, there's a maybe, and let's have a look at it. And I love them both. They're amazing. I've had such a nice time. Everyone on this set's happy, and that's because of those guys. They set the tone, as always, the top down, and everyone's just thrilled to bits to be here. And then to be directed by George, I'm learning from a master, ultimately. I mean, I could beat around the bush, but I'm learning from someone that has done this for a while and has done it really incredibly well. And I'm learning. And I made the decision very early doors to be like, I commit to you, whatever you think, let's go, and I'll try to find within the boundaries you give me. And yeah, it's been great. It's been a really wonderful, beautiful experience. Everyone loves an underdog story because I believe most people in the world are an underdog, and we can align ourselves with these heroes as they go through their journey and they achieve the unthinkable. And that's what these guys do, ultimately. And at every point in their journey, they're doubted and they're pushed and they're prodded and they're told they can't do it. But they all have, with this belief from Ulbrichtsen, a through line in which they deep down know that they can do something incredible, and they do it.
When I first read the screenplay for Boys in the Boat, it just seemed to me to be a completely, perfectly laid out, winning and feel good, sports story. And, every now and then a story comes along that you feel like it's sort of, in terms of, like a story or a movie, is a little bit almost too good to be true. And for the most part, apart from leaving some things out and condensing certain aspects of this story, it's pretty much laid out the way it was. Stuff's compressed, and as I said, stuff's there's more stuff to put in there, and you could make a much longer film. But the real events lend themselves to such a kind of great sports film. The film carries that theme of unity, you know, given that you've got 8 boys in one vessel, and you know, no matter how great the individual may be, they're only as good as the 8 of them or the 9 of them working together. And I think that's pretty kind of cool and crucial. I mean, and also it's a tough sport. And it is a tough sport and unique in that sense that it's not just, you know, I mean, look, every sport has its own sort of unique qualities, but the idea that you've got 8 people having to be in complete synchronicity and aligned in sense of their own power, and each position on the boat has its own little specialties in a way, but essentially you've got, you know, 8 guys trying to be as equally powerful as each other. Well, Al Ulbrichtson is, you know, he's the coach of the varsity and the junior varsity team. And in the context of our story, you know, what is important is that Al was a champion rower himself, although that's not really brought too much into focus, but he understands the sport from the inside. And in terms of the sense of the story being about an array of underdogs, even Ulbrichtson as a coach, you know, in his suits and his sort of large office and his university posting, is still, we get a sense that if things don't work out for him and the team, that he's always a couple of decisions away from losing funding and potentially losing his job, and that he has to answer to a bunch of sort of money people, and that the university itself, in terms of the sport of rowing, is an underdog. So, you know, Al is this... you know what I saw Ulbrichtson as? I've always been fascinated, and this is what my early conversations with George and Grant were. I'm always fascinated by the coach that's on the sideline of the football field or on the side of the swimming pool who just doesn't look like they're enjoying a single moment of the sport that they've dedicated their life to. And while on one hand you could judge that person as angry or bitter or frustrated, right, it's all born out of a desire to succeed. In my mind, Ulbrichtson is like a tough father, or like a tough love kind of father. And they can really inspire, but they can also be hard to reach, you know. And so there's all these sort of moments in the script where even Ulbrichtsen's wife is letting him know that he actually looks okay when he smiles. That everybody's sort of wondering why this guy is not enjoying himself. And I felt like that was a really good thing to hold on to leading into the movie, is that this guy just doesn't seem to not only enjoy himself, but show much warmth. You know, and as a result, you'll see in the film, the speeches, the pre-game speeches to the boys are not necessarily like... He's not an inspiring orator. It's very much like, this many strokes, this is what you do in the first half of the race, this is what you do in the second half of the race. Watch out for this problem in the water. But it's not like what happens towards the end, which is letting them know that he's actually proud of them. You know, all underdog stories have a character that has the whole set of obstacles stacked against them. And Joe is somebody who's essentially homeless, and comes to rowing not because he has love for the sport. He comes to rowing because he has a desire to put a roof over his head and money in his pocket, and to get a seat on the rowing team means that he'll get a dormitory and he'll get a job. And the problem with Joe is that he's a loner, and he's been forced into being a loner by being abandoned by his own family. and kind of fending for himself from a very young teenage age. And so by this set of circumstances, he's physically capable enough to earn a seat on the boat. And he has the promise to be a good rower, but what he has to learn to do is to become part of a family again and to trust that he can do that. And I guess in some ways, Ulbrichtsen starts to become, in some ways, like a role, takes on the role of a father to him. Not in the sense that we are spending a lot of time, what's the word, you know, growing fond of each other. But certainly he would see the ability to be accepted or to be rejected in me. Oh, George is the most beautiful character. You know, he's basically the builder of the shelves. And it seems to be this sort of mysterious and uplifting kind of folklore around George Pocock. Seemed to be a person that people loved, was highly respected. He built shelves for all sorts of universities and from the Ivy League schools, and he was in-house at Washington for a time at least. Just a guy who knew his stuff and was the best at it. And really kind of in our story, you get a sense he's sort of the closest thing to a Jedi that we've got in this. You know, like he's like a man who understands the sport as poetry. He reveres it in a way. It's a religion when you're around George, and he sees it as a beautiful thing. Boys in the Boat is a film about finding a family, I think, you know, and about achieving something together. And while these boys don't know each other, you know, the bond that's formed, and it's very personal, it's very human. So I think that it won't just be a rowing film. It'll be a film about pulling something out of yourselves that you didn't know you had. You know, there's a certain swagger and a masculinity to certain actors. And then if they are willing to and confident enough to show a dimension of, you know, vulnerability and fragility or fear, it makes for a full person. It makes for a more interesting character. And I think that's something that Callum is very interesting because of that. He's a big guy, and he's obviously very confident in some aspects, and you know the impression, the silhouette of him is that he's a capable man and a tough guy in some aspects, but there's also a softer side to him. So to be able to see the boy and the man at the same time, I think is really good. And you know, some of my favourite actors have that quality or have that duality. I'm always impressed by actors that make films, and particularly actors that make good films, and that have a track record of making good. And George has made a handful of movies, you know, a good handful. And I was just curious, like, what it would be like being on set with him. And, you know, it makes sense, but he knows a set. Like, and, you know, if you're a smart actor and you're interested in filmmaking, you start to observe what's going on. You can definitely switch off to that stuff and go to your trailer and walk out and be like, where's my mark? And I'll say this, and then I'll go back to my trailer. But if you want, you can really kind of sponge up information. And he really knows how a set works. He knows how a camera works, where to put a camera, how efficiently he could shoot certain scenes versus being very meticulous about other ones. And he's super confident about when he's happy to move on. Like really confident about going, okay, I've got 2 takes in the can, I'm happy with them, I'm going to move on. Whereas you might, in the hands of I mean, every director's different. I wouldn't say it's a lack of confidence to do multiple takes, but some people really do overshoot things. But the long and the short of it is George really understands the technical requirements of a set. He knows the equipment. He knows everybody's, he doesn't presume to do everybody's job, but he obviously knows what everybody's job is. He's a great person to be around. And he and Grant have done an incredible amount of research. Look, I hope, I guess in some way I feel like the audience should have a really celebratory experience, and maybe sitting in a cinema, if that's what I hope they do, that they'll feel like an extension of the crowd at the Olympics or at Poughkeepsie. I just think it's an interesting and a crucial time to be watching stories that make us feel good. I've always been someone who's like, I like movies that make me feel challenged and bad. And lately, I don't know whether it's because I'm older or I've become a father or because of sort of a post-COVID sort of feeling. But I'm more interested in watching movies that are going to make me feel like, when the credits roll. So I think this film is one of those things that's going to make people feel good about things,
Love the screenplay. I was sort of hooked right away, and it really brought me on a ride emotionally, and like all the competitions and the races, and it was so fun. And I instantly wanted to be a part of it, just because I feel like they don't make movies like this anymore. Just like these big stories that are just so fun to watch, and there's so many moments of victory and fun, and yeah, I fell in love with all the characters too. I love that it's a movie, that uses sports as sort of a vessel to tell the story, but there's this an emotional undercurrent throughout the whole thing, and you become so attached to the stories and or the characters, and they're also such specific people, and you really fall in love with the protagonist, Joe Rantz, yeah, I just thought it's such a great story of hope. Look at his background. You just think, how could he get through all these challenges and struggles that he's come up against? And he does. And he becomes such a strong character with such a strong will. And yeah, I can't believe it's true, but it is. So we first meet Joyce at University of Washington, and she's studying to become a teacher, but she explains that she's also sort of running away from her family and her home life, and because it's a very austere household that she's grown up in. And yeah, she's in a classroom, she's taking classes, and that's when she runs into Joe, and she's like, oh wait, I know you. I had a crush on you when I was a little girl. I mean, it's a sweet moment. I think Joe is rowing at the beginning just for, room and board, and he wants to make some money, and it's survival for him and a lot of the boys, considering their backgrounds, where they come from. But then they all become really passionate about it, and they become sort of this band of brothers in a way. I love playing Joyce. It's not often that you can be plunged into this love story that's really just beautiful and pure at its core. It's a very pure love story because they've loved each other since they were kids, and they're each other's one and only, and there's just so much fun to it, and it's such a good time. George is the best. I mean, he's so great, and he's so fun. He loves to have fun, and he shows up with so much energy every day. Like, even if he's tired, he'll just have a huge grin on his face, and I think that's so important because then it kind of allows for everybody else to sort of just feel at ease and just have a good time. And he's just a really good guy, and also he knows exactly what he's doing. And yeah, that energy he brings is really contagious. Callum's amazing. Callum is just a ray of sunshine. He's just such a good guy. And he's also really diligent. He's so diligent and such a leader. He's all the qualities that Joe has, and so I think maybe it's an easy transition, easy to step into the role. Callum's the best, though. He's just, from day one, he's been so professional and so kind, and it radiates and it affects everybody in the room. It's all about teamwork. It's about these boys who all kind of come from nowhere, very little means, and they come together and they accomplish something as a team. And I think, it's really important it's an important message because I think it's telling you that, you know, you can't bear your burdens alone and that you need people to lean on in times of struggle. And it is a really difficult time in history, and also for these boys, and they're coming together and they're accomplishing something huge. And I don't think they think they're going to get that far, but they do, I think, through being able to lean on each other and also like trust in the person in front of you and behind you in the boat, and they learn that throughout. It doesn't start that way. I just think it's absolutely stunning to watch, and it's in nature, and when the boys work as one, it's so graceful and it's so satisfying to watch, and so the rowing is incredible, but also the movie's not just about the rowing, it's about so much more than that as well.
I was really excited. I had actually read the book years earlier, and I read it on my own accord. I just picked it up, heard it was a great book, and I remember saying to my then girlfriend, now wife at the time, this would be the most amazing movie. So that when I heard it was being made into a movie, and I heard that Grant and George were doing it, I was so thrilled. And then when I read the script was such a great adaptation of a book, and I don't think it's that easy to adapt a book with that much kind of pathos and character. I mean, that's a really full book, and I think that they did an amazing job of adapting it into a screenplay. Yeah, so Tom is he's the JV coach. You know, Albrechtsen, Al, is the varsity coach. He's the head coach of the entire rowing contingency. But Tom is kind of the junior coach to Al. And when you meet Tom in the film, you know, he's basically Al's right-hand guy. You know, he's just as passionate about the boys. He is a rowing coach through and through. He goes on in his life to coach, become a head coach at other universities, and rowing is his life as well. And so you kind of see him as a sort of ally to Al Albrechtsen. But what he also is in the movie, which I love, is he's also sometimes can point to the counterpoint of what Al is thinking. I know when Al makes this big decision to send the JV team instead of the varsity, that's a huge point of contingency between the guys. And, you know, Tom tries to point out to Al, hey, I don't know if that's the best idea. You know, we have huge stakes, you know, riding here. And ultimately, Al's decision overrides Tom's, and it ultimately becomes the right decision. But I think that's, you know, there's a nice give and take between Al and Tom throughout the film. I think that Albrechtsen is this amazing example of someone who is willing to put it all on the line for what he believes in. You know, I think that's, quite frankly, what differs between Bowles and Albrechtsen, you know, and Albrechtsen. The difference between Albrechtsen and Bowles is, you know, Bowles believes in these boys. Bowles is committed to the team, but at the same time, he's thinking about his life and, you know, is this going to be too much of a chance to take? Whereas Albrechtsen, he's willing to risk it all in order to win. He's willing to risk it all because he believes in these boys, and it's through that belief and through that strength that these boys become the team that goes to the Olympics. The story is a great story, and it's a true story. And I think anytime you're telling a true story, you have a great responsibility to do it as honest as possible. And so for me, it's a great honor to be here, be a part of this film, to work with George and Grant and this incredible cast on a story that I love. You know, really, what much more can you ask for as an actor? So it's been a real joy. I think we respond to underdog stories because I think that's the story of life. I think all of us see an underdog in ourselves. You know, every day, you know, we're faced with challenges and we have to overcome them. And whether, you know, who can measure how much of an underdog you are, but I think we all feel akin to that. And so I think when you see a story about that on this level, you want to rush to go see it. I know I do.
My name is Judy Rantz Willman, and Joe Rantz, one of the lead characters in The Boys in the Boat, was my father. Well, Joe Rantz was one of the guys who was on the 8-oar crew team, University of Washington team, that went to the 1936 Berlin Olympics and took a gold medal in front of Hitler. And the story, I mean, this was during the Depression. The story is a story of hardship and determination and fellowship, and I mean, it was an amazing story. A lot of things that went wrong that they shouldn't have been able to overcome throughout, like, that entire time, pretty much, that they were on crew. And so my feeling, especially with my dad, who had had a seriously hard childhood that affected how he could relate to other people even, because he had no trust left. And of course, crew is a sport which requires absolute, ultimate trust of the team members in one another. So I was feeling like it was, especially now, when we seem to have so much trouble trusting each other or working together, anything like that, I was feeling like it was important to get this story out so that people could read it. He was abandoned, and he was sent off, and he was moved to places he didn't know. He was basically treated as a disposable child. And so he had a decision that he had to make. He had to decide, was he going to be a victim or a survivor? And his decision was that, by God, he was going to be a survivor, and he was going to finish high school. But he was never again going to trust anybody for his future, for his, to trust with his life, with his ability to survive. He was going to do it on his own. And that was what he did. He did a lot of stuff at Roosevelt. One of the things he did was he joined their gymnastics team. And he was one day on the team, and by this time he was pretty impressive. He was like 6'2.5", and very well muscled, because a lot of the stuff he'd done was really, to keep himself alive, to earn money, was really heavy-duty stuff. And here's this tall, muscled kid doing grand circles on the high bar. And Al Ulbrichtson, the coach from the University of Washington rowing program, is out sort of scouting around the various high schools, looking at possible recruits for his rowing program. And there he sees Dad doing these circles on the high bar. And he goes across the hall to the chemistry lab and asks the chemistry teacher, "Who's that kid on the high bar?" And the chemistry teacher says, oh, that's my younger brother, Joe. And so it's basically, well, when he gets to the university, you have him look me up. So there he was. He was going to be heading for the university. He was a self-sufficient kid, but he was a kid who had been basically disposable and didn't trust anybody. Right. Trying to head into a situation which required the ultimate in trust and teamwork. Dan was, by the time he'd gotten through talking with Dad for a fair amount of time, he got to the place of, he knew he wanted to write the book, but he hadn't really asked Dad about it yet. And he got to the place of broaching the subject. And Dad said, "No, I don't want you to write a book about me, but you can write about the boat." Well, I think they knew that they couldn't have accomplished what they did without every single other member on the team. And so your humility comes from the fact that you know you're not as good alone. You can't do it alone, what you can do with the team behind you. I think the thing that impressed me the most about what Dad did and what the rest of the guys did was that they all had, they were facing serious handicaps, and the fact that it was hard. And with rowing, there's not that much glory, and you have to share it anyway. And they had to keep at it. You couldn't back off. You couldn't not give it your best. You couldn't let your focus slip. It was just plain a very, very hard sport to survive in. And I think that the fact that they did, that they kept it up, was one of the things that impressed me the most about that whole situation. Every one of those guys felt like they were the weak link in the boat. Every one. They felt like, and at that point where they're a bonded team, it becomes more and more important that you don't let the other guys down, that you don't be the person who is the one who backs off or loses strength or whatever happens that makes you become what you sort of believe yourself to be, which is the weak link. They had to, I mean, what they went up against was something that they shouldn't have been able to do. And it was really, as far as I'm concerned, mainly the fact that not one of those guys would give up. Not one of them. Even looking at the shape that Don Hume, the stroke, was in with what we strongly suspect was walking pneumonia at that point. But not one of them would give up, and I don't think anybody expected that, and they couldn't beat it. In the Amazon reviews, there were so many of them that were comments related to, I would have quit reading this if it weren't a true story, because it's unbelievable, and yet it happened. And because it happened, that's one of the interesting things with the people who read. Because it happened, they had to feel like, okay, if they could do that, really do that, then maybe I could do this. Maybe I could, learn to row or play the piano or continue in school. We got letters from kids' moms saying that they were so inspired about how that had happened that they decided, if they were going to back off in school, no, they decided they would keep going. It's inspirational. I think it's a wonderful story, and I think that George Clooney, who directed and produced it, I think he does an amazing job of pulling what is a very large, broadly ranging story into focus enough that you can get it into a 2-hour movie, you can understand what the heart of the story is. And I think I especially like the fact that there's a fair amount of footage of Mom in there too. And for giving her due, I really enjoyed seeing that. But I think that people are going to feel like when they come out of that, they come out of it, I hope, changed. Like they have a better feeling for what can you do if you approach life with a positive attitude, if you work with other people as a team. It's got the potential to maybe help us in these days.
I'm a huge fan of sports films, and so I'd always been looking for one of those, and George and I had talked about it, and Grant, and so it was the idea of these young men being such underdogs, being, really none of them, should have been in the boat at some time. They all had things, so many things to overcome, so many hurdles, so many, other things. And it was just the story, the lives of those boys, and putting them in the boat together and watching them, it's just, to me, it's just the truest underdog story. The book itself and the story of these boys, it's so sprawling, and it takes place over several years of while they're in school. And so the biggest change I made was I condensed everything into 1 year, so that we would keep the boys, because in the book, we meet a lot of boys that are on the first team or the JV team, the squads, and then by the next year they're gone, and so we have to meet new boys and everything. And so, which would work great in a limited series where we really had time to kind of go with all of them, but in a motion picture, in a film, it needs to be a little bit more condensed and just that straight through line. And I'm a very structural writer, and so whenever I kind of know I kind of have a sense for the rhythm of where these things kind of need to be, and whenever we have too many, it just threw things out of whack. And even though when the script was 150 pages, it just stayed with these boys. It stayed with the same thing. I never tried to kind of go outside and kind of explore the other years, because it just felt like this was the one we needed to focus on. They gave me the book. George and Grant gave me the book, and they told me that there were other screenplays that had been written, but they asked me not to look at them. And they said, just kind of come up with your own version and what you want to do. So I went through and just started kind of building it out. And I told them, I gave them like a 20-page treatment of what I wanted to do, and kind of pitched them the idea of staying in this 1 year rather than going through, all the different ones and meeting the different characters, and how we could focus and we could really kind of wrap our arms around. We'd have a better opportunity to wrap our arms around the boys, if we just stayed with them. And so that worked. And so George and Grant signed off, and I wrote the script, and then George worked his magic. For me, it's always been the idea. I think everyone pulls for the little guy, don't they? I mean, whether it's, a race, a boxing match, business, anything, life. It's like the ones that you feel like are a little disadvantaged, the ones that have to work a little bit harder. It's like there's something about that makes us want to really kind of root for them. And we just had a boatload full of them here. So it was just like, it's impossible not to pull for these kids. And so it's just always been that way, especially in sports, athletic events. It seems like we're always looking for that underdog kind of to take down the champion, to take down the larger school, or, whatever. The editing is just out of this world. I mean, while they were shooting, George and Grant both told me it's that the trick of this film was going to be to edit the racing so that it would continue to be interesting. So each one felt a little different. That was the one thing. Whenever I'm writing it, I can use different words and I can use different motions and different things during the races. But when you're shooting it, it can look the same. It's like, it's just these guys in a boat and they're just rowing and they're going past other boats. But the way they shot it and the way that Tanya edited it, it's just like, oh yeah, it's beautiful. The face of the boys for us, and I think for Dan Brown's novel as well, is Joe Rantz. And he kind of personifies in his life the battles, almost the same ones that, the hurdles that the team would have to overcome. And the great thing about Joe was he was kind of abandoned as a boy, so that he grew to just rely on himself. He was just a loner who thought he would just take care of things on his own, didn't need help, didn't need anything. And rowing is the exact opposite of that. And so Joe, for me, was who I immediately focused on, because he was almost the odd man out in this. It's like the one piece that doesn't fit in a sport where you have to work so well together is the guy that wants to work by himself. And for Joe to kind of overcome everything that he'd been through, to kind of learn and accept and trust these other guys to help him, that together they were actually stronger. He'd never had that in his life. And so Joe is kind of the face of it. And then his best friend Roger, who kind of got him into the crew, and they did it simply because they were trying to make enough money to eat and have a bed to sleep in, because they were just there was nothing at this time in the Depression. They literally had no place. Joe's sleeping in a car. It's like, so he by getting on this team, he might have a room, he might have a roof, he might have a bed, he might have some food. And then the idea of where they would go with this never entered their minds. This was, it was so far beyond it. They were really just trying to have a normal life. working together, trusting the people around you, trusting people that you don't necessarily know very well, and trying to learn, trying to understand them so that you can trust them, so that you can work. It's not just for a boat, that can be used in a lot of things. That can be used in life. I think we are sorely missing that. The idea of kind of trying to learn about the people around us and understand them, and so that we can work together a little better.
I mean, it's an epic story, and it's just to recreate Olympic races is a huge challenge. The scale of the story is exciting, and the most scary thing was basically how to make it look interesting, because these boats are long. It's hard to get to them. Working on water would be challenging, and it's a very monochromatic sport. There's no curves like in car races. They go straight, they move a lot. It's very hard to see them in close-ups. That was a big headache. We knew we would film on lakes and rivers, so we had to find the right tools. So we did a couple of weeks of testing where we put cranes on boats, jib arms, and we tested with drones, we tested with underwater cameras, and put together a package which we thought would be most suitable. And we tested 2 weeks and mounted cameras on boats. And what surprised me is that these boats are actually 60 feet long, but they're also quite fragile. So you have to be really careful with them. And also you don't want to get in the way of the actors or the athletes, because so you had to look for light cameras. You had to look for mounts which would be possible, suitable. Arms, which also, the boats we're using have also an impact on the water. So we couldn't create too much wake, because that would sink them. Certain angles you can only film with a drone, and all of that is a lot we tested. We know that a big part of the film would be on water. So on water, and with these boats moving and with us getting closer, it felt the choice was obvious that we couldn't light it, or we could have taken boats to the studio and then create a world around, but we didn't want that. We wanted it to feel real, so we started with a big naturalistic approach. So the water work should look as real as possible, and then coming from there, the lighting, I feel like, should be naturalistic. We shouldn't do over stylization. So that led us to the way we lit it. The good thing about George having done Perfect Storm is he knew that it would be a challenge. And like yesterday, we talked about it, and he said this was probably the most challenging film we've done together. And also for him as a director, because working on water and working with all these elements, and you just, all of a sudden, you're very exposed to elements, and just to get the right angle and lock in positions is really challenging. So he was very aware, and he was patient with us and with the process, and respected that a lot. So that made it much easier for us. For me, one of the key things of George as a director is he creates this environment on set which makes it easy and everybody's at comfort. He's very quick in taking decisions, and he's really a visual filmmaker, and I think maybe that's one of the things people overlook, because he knows where the camera is, what it does, and he's very precise in keeping to a style, and he's not like fishing around. He knows what he wants, and he's very quick in deciding.
It's so motivating, that you can come from behind, you can come from nothing and make something great. And I also really loved the connection with all of them. They're such individual boys, you know, and so that connection that they made to be great. And, you know, always the come from behind, but always they never think you can do it. And then you know, the shock and the surprise to be that excellent at something that you haven't really done your whole life, as some have. So I think it's about mind, and that understanding that you can do something was what really motivated me. So much, really so much information for me in the costumes out there, you know, but it was also just to get a sense of, you know, kind of tell yourself a little bit better what it was happening at the time. You know, my grandparents taught me a lot about the Depression because they were Depression-era kids, teens, and so it was a part of my life all the time. So I had a sense, but to really dive in and look and see, you know, books and internet and, you know, connecting with the University of Washington, they were incredibly helpful in their research and giving us anything we needed, and so supportive of the film. And so there's a lot out there. And then, you know, you do a broad overall scope to see what's happening in 1936, 34, 35, 36, and what's the world look like. And then once you get those characters down, you dive deeper and individualize them, because then you have to give them. In the book, it's, you know, he's very good about describing each one of these gentlemen and where they come from precisely, and the documentary, the PBS documentary, helped so much as well, because you could see it, and they had so much stuff that was so, you know, wonderful to see, and that you could get yourself really dialed in. And so I had so much fun. I researched this for several months just because it was a joy to do. I met them the first day they arrived in the UK to start training. I went to the first initial day. You know, we had gathered some rowing practice stuff for them, just modern day stuff, so they could have a kit together. So I met them all, and then they came and got measured. You know, and of course, I think Sam, who plays Roger Morris, would say, he says this all the time, I remember you asked me, Jenny, if I was gonna get skinnier. And thinking, and, you know, they have completely transformed themselves. You know, who, of course you would think so. You know, they worked really diligently at the rowing, because the gentlemen, you know, the real rowers from 1936 were different. Bodies were different. The exercises were different, the way you exercise. So they really leaned out in a very different way. But for me, the lucky part was, you know, they did come from not so wonderful backgrounds, and nobody at the time really had a lot of money. So if they didn't fit perfect, that was better than not, you know? So by them losing weight, it looked like they maybe hadn't been eating, as the script in the book kind of described, that was the only meal they would get once they got to school. So it was really helpful, I think, to push, but I didn't have to change a lot even from the beginning, because it kind of gave that sense that what we wanted it to look like. I knew it was going to be incredibly simple. You know, I think he has a shirt and a pair of jeans and a sweater. That's it. Where else would he have gotten anything? And, you know, George he really wanted it to feel worked in and worn in. And as the script describes rather, you know, it's torn, ripped up. So we wanted to keep something simple. So we kind of made it, you know, generic enough. So where you see it all the time, but you don't get sick of it. But that's an easy way to tell the story, you know, for him. It's certainly not going to spend any money on clothes. That's the last place he's going to eat. He needs a roof over his head. And then, you know, we assumed that once he got on the team and they were traveling, that somehow somebody's helped him get a suit, whether it be, you know, an older brother that he did have, or somebody helped him, you know, get something. Because, you know, it's still typical when these athletes travel in teams, they dress up. You know, it's a respectful thing to represent your country, your state, wherever you're going. But those guys wore the same suit at every function they were in. Because we go to 3 different major cities, we needed to tell a difference between them. So Seattle, you know, and also to sell sort of the time period, but also the Depression. You know, Seattle is someplace very different. It was a very young city at the time, and so it's very different than something like, say, New York City. So I really wanted to tell the difference, and them boys landing in New York City, and oh my gosh, this is something they never thought they'd be a part of. So big and so grand. So Seattle was very sort of muted tones, you know, with some rust and very autumnal kind of that feeling of warmth, but yet it was a little bit more down. And then New York City was white. Everything felt, like it was this place, and it was summertime and just felt more rich, like it was coming up. And then I thought about, for Germany, I really wanted to make it like the beautiful black and white photographs, in a sense, where it was kind of muted down again, but a little bit rich. It was important for Hitler to sell to the world at this time, and when you read this a lot, that, everything was A-okay, and this is the booming city, and so everybody was in their best. But I also wanted it to feel very muted as well, and darker, kind of sinister in a little bit of a way. Very big aspirational film for what we had to do to make it, and the support of a team like we had, and everybody stepping up and wanting to, because the story is so good. And a lot of people said, on my team when they came in, I'm so excited to do this. It's such an amazing story, and I want to be a part of something like that. So I think these kinds of stories inspire people. It's everybody can feel this way, and I think by doing that, it's really it's just made it so much more. What is the word I'm looking for? Rewarding, so much more rewarding to be able to, see it all come to fruition, and know that every single person on my team, and on the entire crew for that matter, has worked together to get here.
Shortly after George got involved in the project and got attached to direct the film, he was kind enough to give me a call, which surprised me, but really pleased me. And we had a long conversation about the book. And I was really heartened. It was very obvious talking to him on the phone that he not only had read the book, but that he really got it. He got the spirit of the book. He understood what the heart of the story was. And in fact, he talked about it in personal terms. He grew up quite poor in Kentucky. And so that helped him identify with this sort of ragtag bunch of kids that are at the heart of the story of the boys in the boat. And so he elaborated on how he personally felt connected to Joe Rantz, who was the principal character in the story, and the hardship that Joe went through as a young man and as a boy. So as he was talking about that, I really felt that he was really in touch with what was most important about telling the story. These 9 young men are in many ways representative of their generation. They were hardscrabble kids growing up in very hard times. They had qualities that they had to acquire in order to survive: perseverance and a sort of relentless drive to get ahead, coping with hard circumstances, humility in the face of obstacles, a willingness to pull together and try to help each other. So I think a lot of those things are things that we've lost along the way, or we don't cultivate as much as we once did. So their story for me in many ways is representative of the struggle that whole generation of Americans went through. And that's certainly one of the things that attracts me to the story. And I think it's one of the things that attracted George Clooney to it as well. In many ways, it's a feel-good story. It helps us feel good about ourselves as a people. It reminds us of what we're capable of when we pull together. It was one of the things that George mentioned when I talked to him the first time, and it's certainly one of the principal things that matters to me about the story. It's just, this is the right time, I think, for Americans to see a story like this. I think they're going to find it uplifting, inspiring, and I think they're going to come out of the theaters feeling good about being American. And there's a real hunger for this kind of story, a real hunger for stories about people working collaboratively, working with one another rather than against one another, and to use the metaphor of the book, simply pulling together. So I think there's a huge demand for that. I think there's a hunger for it. I do think everybody loves an underdog story, and this is a classic underdog story. In many ways, it reminds me of Seabiscuit, Laura Hillenbrand's book, which of course was this ragtag little horse that then nobody thought could win. The whole generation of Americans sort of fixated on Seabiscuit because that horse represented them in many ways. I think these 9 young men in the boat, in a very similar way, galvanized the attention of the nation because people felt they could identify with them. These were young working class men. They were the sons of farmers and fishermen and loggers. There was nothing pretentious about them. They were having a hard time making a way in the world. So it was easy, I think, during the Depression for Americans to see them as representative of themselves. You know, Joe was basically thrown away by his father and his stepmother. He was treated almost as disposable. He was left to fend for himself, living virtually in the woods as a teenager. And he had to find a way to make sense of his life and to find a place in the world, having been discarded so casually. My experience with readers of the book is that they're very drawn to Joe's story because it's a story of redemption and a story of how a vulnerable young man can find his way in the world through something like, in this case, crew, which gave him a purpose. It bonded him to other young men of his generation. So I think the Joe Rantz story is very central to the way people respond to the story. Part of what's charming for me about the story is that these young men had essentially no rowing experience. To get where they wound up winning the Olympics, they had to row against their very good rivals at Cal Berkeley, but then they had to row against kids from the East Coast, kids who had almost grown up with oars in their hands, kids who'd gone to prep schools and had learned to row as adolescents or children even. These guys had no experience like that at all. The first time they climbed into a racing shell was in the 1930s when they joined the crew program. So it's all more remarkable. And then they had to go on and defeat the British crew in Berlin. And again, you're talking about young men from Oxford and Cambridge who had gone to private, or what they call public schools in the UK and learned to row there. So all the way through their rowing careers, they were rowing against higher and harder levels of competition until they finally rowed against a Nazi crew in Germany. So Coach Ulbrichtsen's job was definitely on the line in 1936. It was clear that he was going to lose his position if he didn't at least get his crew to Berlin, if not win the gold medal. Ulbrichtsen was a man of few words often. He could be very tough. He was often hard on the young men that rowed for him. But he also was kind of a genius. He understood that putting a great crew together involves a kind of alchemy. It involves mixing and matching different personality types and different physical types to find a formula that actually makes the boat go faster. And he experimented in the spring of 1936 a lot with the JV boat, putting boys in, taking boys out, trying to find just that magical combination of strengths that would cut the, would make the day in Berlin. And he finally found it actually when he added Joe Rantz to the boat quite late that spring. It's amazing to realize that in the 1930s, on a given Saturday afternoon, 60, 70, 80,000 people might turn out for a crew race on Lake Washington in Seattle or on the Hudson River in New York or any number of places across the country. It was an enormously popular spectator sport. It was also a sport that drew a lot of national attention from the press. Crew races were covered coast to coast by the major papers. Coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. Prominent oarsmen found their faces on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines, and millions of dollars were spent betting on the outcome of these races. Pocock was, in many ways, I think, the crew's secret ingredient or character behind the curtain. Pocock, as Ulbrichtsen in some ways was the bad cop, in some ways Pocock was the good cop. As I say, Ulbrichtsen could be very hard on the boys. He was hard to predict. George Pocock was sort of a Yoda-like figure to these young men. He was wise, he was well-read, he was always full of pithy and interesting pieces of advice. And he was willing to share that advice with these young men. So oftentimes, if they were down because of what Ulbrichtson had told them. They'd go find Pocock. Pocock would remind them in one way or another by telling a story or whatever he would remind them of what they were capable of. So he was an inspiration to them. And he was an inspiration not just to the 36 crew, but to generations of rowers at the University of Washington. You know, this story is one of the rare times when I've been researching a book that as the more I dug into the story, the more incredible it became. Oftentimes when you start researching a book, it just sort of fizzles out or isn't as rich a possibility as you thought it might be. This story, as I dug into it and I discovered characters like George Pocock and the influence he had on the crew and the improbability of Don Hume, the stroke oar, getting sick just before the final race, and all these little plot points and twists that I couldn't have contrived if I was a writer of fiction were already there for me as a writer. So it was a wonderful sort of voyage of exploration for me to uncover the story. And it's remarkable. There are lots of twists in the story. A lot of unexpected things came up. I think it reads as well as good fiction, absolutely. Seeing the film for the first time was a remarkable experience. I didn't know what to expect. I was a little nervous. I hadn't really had much role in shaping it. So I was sitting there, I was quite nervous. The film began to roll, and we watched it, and I'd say about halfway into the film, I started liking it right away. Then about halfway into the film, I could hear my wife sniffling next to me, and that's always a really good sign. And then by 10 minutes later, I was sniffling and wiping tears away. And Sharon, my wife, was wiping tears away. So I knew right then and there that if it could touch me, I'm somebody that knows this story inside out. I've been living with it for over 10 years now. I'm pretty confident that if it can touch me and touch my wife, it's going to touch a lot of viewers. It really does resonate well. So I think for me, this story is important in our time, primarily because I see it as a sort of metaphor for, first of all, for that generation of Americans who lived through the Depression, who literally had to learn to pull together simply to survive first the Depression and then get through World War II. They were literally all found themselves, maybe not literally, metaphorically, found themselves in the same boat at the beginning of the Great Depression. So they had to learn to pull together. So for me, the story ultimately is a metaphor for that generation's ability to persevere, to pull together, to get things done. But then also, I think it's a lesson, an object lesson for my generations and younger generations to look at and say, wow, these guys had some wisdom, and it was wisdom born of really hard experiences, but it's wisdom worth paying attention to.
Well, I didn't specialise at all. I was just a boat builder. I built singles, doubles, triples, 4s and 8s. And there was a lot of them in 70 years. But I was not known as a builder of 8s. They tended to think, or I think, that the general rowing public thought we'd better go to a bigger manufacturer, one of the big names in the country, and don't trust that little bloke down in Richmond on his own, you know. But I did do some winning 8s, so yeah, it's possible. There was lots and lots of head scratching went on, I promise you. But luckily we had a few photos. They're only prints this big to work from, and the architect's drawings. But we knew the basic measurements, and we didn't have premises long enough to build it in one piece. The shop we had was 45 feet long, and the 8 was 61 feet. So we built 5 seats, 5/8 of the boat on one stocks, and then next to that we had another stocks which we built the other 3 seats on, and it all bolts together. But it's quite interesting, hoping it's going to bolt together, having built the 2 bits separately. You've got a 60-foot boat that weighs 250 pounds or so, and then you've got 100 stone of men going in it. If you get it a bit wrong, the whole lump of men, so you'd say is this long, you get it down there a bit too much, boat goes like that, or like that. And that was one measurement that was never given, and I had to guess that. But touch wood, it worked out all right. 8 people to row as one is not very easy. It comes after, a month or so of practice, but not. You never get 8 people jump in a boat and be uniform all in one go.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and comment on the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be notified when new videos are released.